from the beginning. There we are. Oh, we're being recorded. All right, I'll have to be polite. Oh dear, it dropped back out when we did that. Hang on, from the beginning. There we are. So I want to start with just a little bit of an icebreaker I like to use at meetings. And I know a couple of people in the chat know this. I think, Lou, I may have to disqualify you because you'll know the answer. Or maybe you'll have to be the one that tells everybody. But in the Star-Spangled Banner, what does spangled mean? And I can't see you, so you don't worry about the chat. Somebody can just unmute themselves and yell it out. But it is a technical term. So what does spangled mean? If we were in person, I'd have a fabulous prize, like a really ugly mug for you, but sadly I don't. Anyone want to take a guess? If anyone is
I always thought it meant sparkle, like I don't know, spangled, like bedazzled.
Is it shot up?
It does for clothing. I'm sorry. What did you say?
Is it shot up? It's got holes in it?
Well, this is the original flag. No. Actually, what it means when somebody's in the chat. Have we got? I can't see the chat. Someone else have to check it. But what it means is look at the stars in the blue field. They are not sitting upright. The top row tips to the right. The second row tips to the left. That's technically what spangling is. They don't sit upright vertically. We've come to think of it as like a dress that's been spangled with beads or whatever. But in a technical flag term, and yes, that's not the correct term for flag, the study of flags, but that's okay. I'm not Sheldon. But they actually are tipped. And this really is the original flag, of course. And I've interspersed them with the restored versions. Ralph Lauren paid to have the Star-Spangled Banner restored at the Smithsonian. Some of you may have seen it while it was happening. But there's your icebreaker for your next cocktail party. Spangled actually means when they're tipped. So when you see a flag, check it out and see if it really is a Star-Spangled Banner or if it's not. And a lot of the ones you buy, the cheap little ones that get handed out or put out at Christmas or Memorial Day, often aren't because they're made overseas and people don't know what spangling is. So let's move along anyway. Oh, are you going to talk to me today? There we are. This program that I'm talking to you about was funded by the American Battlefield Protection Program, which was created in 1991 and is operated by the National Park Service. And it has now 4 different grant programs. One, the original ones were preservation planning for battlefields. And again, these are significant historic battlefields associated with wars on American soil. So it's very restricted to the US, but all of it, territories as well. So it was preservation planning, battlefield land acquisition. And if you all remember back to Manassas when Six Flags wanted to build right beside Manassas battlefield, and there was a great hoo-ha. That's part of what they want to not have development, big box stores, residences. So there was land acquisition, and the newest ones are battlefield restoration and battlefield interpretation. And so our program looked at Revolutionary War and War of 1812 sites in Maryland and the but maritime sites. And this was interesting because originally this program was, we were flippantly calling it bloody ground, but they wouldn't really consider skirmishes. It had to be like full-fledged war and gore. And they didn't consider maritime sites because how do you draw lines around a battlefield out in the Atlantic? So, obviously it became apparent that you have to look at maritime battles. They're too important. So they started small, Lake Champlain and us, because we have our battles that are up rivers and up creeks, and therefore they're more constrained, and you can draw lines around because the ships didn't go on land. So we know where the battles took place. So we were a very early effort at this. And we, as you can see it from this slide, we worked on it from 1999 to 2000. Then we went back to a number of sites in the ramp up to the bicentennial of the War of 1812. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we did the background research for these, because the idea of battlefield acquisition wasn't an issue. Most of these bottomlands are state-owned already. There wasn't a lot of bloody ground. They were skirmishes. People died and were injured, but it wasn't Gettysburg. So we had to look at these, how do you look at these battlefields? So they took a page out of the military And they use both of these terms. And I think the military actually uses a variation like ACOA or something, but these are the areas they want you to look at when you're doing your research. And so obviously there are going to be areas where more action took place, less action took place. Some were more critical than others. So we also use the National Register of Historic Places as a yardstick. And we have to define through GIS layers and things where the core area is. And there may be some of these lesser things like an avenue of approach that turned out to be critical. So we have all these different layers that have to be studied as well. So it's a little bit more technical and a lot more background work. And in Maryland, of course, it's even more so because any of you who've been in the water in swimming or diving or unintentionally falling in, you'll notice our visibility is not like Florida. I'm getting of that age where if I can get my watch up to where I can see it, I can't read it. And if I move it back to where I can focus on it, I can't see it anymore. Very mucky water. So we rely on electronic remote sensing equipment. And I'm just going to run through these rather quickly. So when I show you other things, you'll know what they are. In the top left, we're looking at these two towfish. The yellow one is a side scan sonar. That sends out an acoustic signal that will detect anything protruding from the bottom. If it's buried, The one on the right is a magnetometer. This happens to be one that runs on cesium gas. And it is sort of like a metal detector, but it is much more sophisticated in that if you, all the minerals in soil are aligned magnetically. And if you, and I'm grossly simplifying this, and if you dig a hole and then fill it up, you've mucked up that alignment. It will pick that up as well. So it doesn't have to be a submarine. What it can't do sometimes, and we discovered this with the War of 1812, some of the metal is so graphitized that I'm holding a handheld metal detector right over iron, supposedly, and it's not registering because all the iron components are out of it and it's just graphite that's left. And the tool on the right is a sub-bottom profiler. We haven't got one yet. I've been asking for one for Christmas for a long time. I think I'm getting it this year, yay. But it penetrates the bottom. So the magnetometer will detect things that are buried or on the surface. You have to learn to read it. The sub-bottom or sub-sediment imager, they're called two things, sub-bottom profiler, sub-sediment imager, will detect things that are buried. And the side scan only detects things that protrude. We then lay out a course now electronically. And on this map, I think you can see my cursor, these pale blue lines, we set those out in advance. And this is where if your parents ever said, don't waste your time with video games, no. You have to be able to hold those lines. It's like mowing the lawn, but you can't fall off the line or it doesn't count anymore. The floor is lava, you know? So these are what side scan images look like. The one on the upper left is a War of 1812 vessel. It was a British vessel. I don't know whether this one was the Diana or the Nelson, but they were captured by the Americans on Lake Ontario, I think at the time, and became the Hamilton and the Scourge. And they went back out and they were both sunk in a storm. So some people died, some got off. One of the famous survivors is James Fenimore Cooper. But what you're looking at is the dark image is actually what's left of the hull. The white ghost tells you how much of its superstructure is left. And you can see this is phenomenal. The masts are still up. This is into over 300 feet of water. This one is a canal boat, and this is up near Perryville. So if you're familiar with that, the head of the bay. And so you can see it's not a huge amount sticking up. You can reverse these depending what you like. If you like the dark being I like the dark being the actual remains and the white being the ghost. My assistant likes the opposite. This is one from a submarine I was asked to find off of Groton. And in this case, the white is the actual remains of the sub. The black is the shadow of the superstructure. And this is fish netting that we were terrified of getting our very expensive gear caught in because it's too deep to dive to retrieve it. So then we have if we take our magnetometer, and here's a combination of both. This is off Ocean City. We were looking at these images, we hadn't seen anything in days, and all of a sudden it's like, ooh, look. And scale is kind of tricks you a little bit. I thought these were about the size of culverts that went, under your driveway so you could cross a ditch. But the magnetometer went berserk. These different shades are part of we call a dipole. I'll show you one in a moment. But when we did a bit more research, it turned out that they are just what they look like, armored personnel carriers from the Korean War. They were being dumped in as artificial reef creation. So just so you can see what we can find. This is the Presidential Yacht Dispatch. And this is what the magnetometer, this is that dipole. It almost always means something cultural. And this is a huge monopole, but in this case, this is very shallow. When we dove it, the monopole was a boiler. And the dipole I was hoping would be a deck gun, but I think it's just a cable. So, and this is where you have to try and stay on the line. Obviously, nobody's perfect, but if you get too far off, you have to rerun these lines. So, and this one is where we had to cheat a little bit and do a MacGyver because we didn't have a sub bottom, but I probably should put the other image up first, but I'll show you this. This is an old magnetometer. They actually printed on paper. Everything's digital now. Our old side scan, we would roll down the halls and write on with a Sharpie. Well, this thing that looks like an EKG was an old kerosene powered magnetometer. And we've got two major hits right here. Then we took our sub bottom, and this is the bottom of the Potomac. This is up around Wason's Corner where Route 4 crosses the Patuxent. This is all submerged, but we've got the bottom, a big lump in the bottom, something very hard and reflective, and two more protuberances that are hard and reflective and match the metal. I very much believe this is one of Joshua Barney's vessels from the War of 1812. I think I know that it's the Islet that was a contracted vessel because it was carrying some cannon that they weren't useful as cannon. They were being used as ballast. And these may have shifted around when it was sunk. Anything that was good was taken to Bladensburg, and we'll come to that later. But it just gives you a sense of some of these. Here's our little MacGyver. This is ground penetrating radar. And these beloved folks from the local Sewells, Calvert County Sewells guys, they came out and we thought it would be frozen. It was January, it was bucketing rain, but we did ground penetrating radar to see if the river had shifted and buried some of these War of 1812 fleet vessels, which would change our scenario to a terrestrial and wetland excavation. But then what we tried is, since we couldn't afford a sub bottom, we put it into a rubber boat and towed it. It can penetrate the rubber. It couldn't penetrate a real boat. And we were able to get the image you saw in the previous slide. So it did work to a certain extent. So never diss MacGyver, it does work. So let's get on with some of our sites. It pretty much works chronologically to go from north to south with the exception of Baltimore, but we'll do it en route. So what we're looking at first, we'll start up in the Elk River up in Cecil County. And we're looking at the Elk, the Bohemia, and then at the bottom, we'll go down to the Sassafras after, but we're looking up in that corner. This is an image put together by Benjamin Latrobe in 1806. Oops, well, I got a little excited with Benjamin there. He was proposing long before the C&D Canal, a way to create a canal in that area. This is what's known as Frenchtown. It doesn't exist anymore. It's a field in private hands. And it's important to us because here on this point, we have what they call the South Wharf. It's identified. We have the old storehouse, which is here. We have Sewells Tavern. All of these are still there. And Henderson's house. And this becomes important because we have this nice painting by Latrobe, watercolor, from the South Wharf, the old storehouse, Sewells Tavern, and Henderson's house in here. And some boats down here because, of course, they're unloading at the storehouse. Two places to unload. Now, the British, the overall governance was by Admiral Cochrane, but his man in the field was actually Admiral Cockburn, and he's the man we hear about. He's the one who burned Washington. And they had made it to the head of the bay, which is interesting because they blocked the Chesapeake long before. They called it a British lake. They were quite, they wanted to block off the privateers who were getting out of Baltimore. They called it that nest of vipers, which we should all take great pride in. We had the best privateers. So by the end of April in 1813, so we're mid-war, Cockburn begins to intensify his raids. And between April 29th and May 6th, he attacked Frenchtown, that we see here, Havre de Grace, which I'm not including because although they did attack the town, no ships were lost. And we were mostly concentrating on ships or anything really distinctive shoreline that we could identify. And Havre de Grace didn't fit the bill. And then we'll go down to the Sassafras and look at Fredericktown and Georgetown. So on April 29th, he ordered his ships to anchor at the mouth of the Elk River. He sent a force of 150 Marines in an armed barge to reconnoiter the river up to Frenchtown. They got lost and they went up the Bohemia, which was good in a way, except the locals did not take advantage of that time that was bought for them. They just really couldn't. There were very few people. They had very little. They were like local militia. They were underarmed. They had a couple of old guns that had been the ballast in fishing boats since the Rev War. So they tried to de-rust them, clean them up and get them functioning, but they were really very sad. But the idea was to disrupt commerce, of course. They said to everyone, if you don't shoot at us, we won't burn anything except government supplies, but we will seize boats because we don't want you carrying messages where we are. So that was sort of the deal they had. It did not work anywhere up here, and there's some doubt that they planned to honor it anyway. So, and of course, Frenchtown at the time was a real nexus for travel between Baltimore and Philadelphia. There's no rail, of course, at this time. So a lot of stages went through there, a lot of ships, things were transshipped, brought up that far and put onto stages or wagons and taken farther up to places like Philadelphia. So the warehouse did carry a lot of military provisions, supplies. And so, of course, there were three at one point, actually earlier, just a month before, 3 American contingents of infantry disembarked here to start marching north to Canada for the fighting along the border. So Coburn, as I said, had planned this sort of pre-dawn raid, but since they got lost, the town had warning they were coming, but they just couldn't do a whole lot. It was a log battery. They had these 4-pounders, and a 4-pounder is about this, it's smaller than a baseball. It's not, super effective against ships or great numbers of people. So and as I said, the last time those guns had seen action was the Rev War. So on April 29th, they had 8 to 10 stagecoach drivers that they'd managed to pull in, a few militia from Elkton, and they did fire at the British. So that gave the British, as they felt, open season to attack the town. The militia had about 12 to 15 rounds each. So by the time they, it didn't take very long for them to run out of ammo. So they had to retreat. The Marines landed, marched to the wharf while the barges bombarded the town. And this was not only shot, but this was some of the first use of Congreve rockets. So the rocket's red glare didn't start in Baltimore. It started here and again at St. Leonard's Creek. So they spiked the cannons when they got there. They burned the warehouses and either took or destroyed military equipment and horse tack. They burned a vessel called the Susquehanna Packet, which was a mail carrier. Packets tended to be. The schooner named Anne and Ruth. And they said, and up to 3 other ships that were anchored in the river. And then they plundered the homes and they questioned the residents and all this, and were trying to figure out what else they could do. They tried to go farther up the river, but there was a chain across the river farther up the Elk at Fort Defiance, and they didn't get much further. So we did a survey up here. And as you can see, this little island didn't exist at the time. It wasn't as shallow. Shoaling is very much a problem here. And we did find possible vessels in these 2 locations, which again, the wharf would have been here. The old storehouse is here. We have another anomaly. We're not sure what it is. And there's the Henderson residence would have been there. We definitely have a wreck here. This may be the Packet. I haven't identified it completely yet. We have to keep watching this area. They keep dredging it out to try and make some commercially viable marinas up there, but every single little storm fills it in again. It's not really a practical solution, but that's not our call. Our call is just to make sure that they don't dredge through the wreck while they're trying to clear the channel in the river. So we did some side scan, and you can see a lovely little boat on the upper left, which looks like a modern motorboat because it is. And on the lower right, it looks like pickup sticks, and it almost is. But when you run a side scan sonar, there's this sort of dead spot underneath it because it can't look under itself. But so you have to go make those lines up and down so that you end up with your target beside, so the acoustics pick it up. We ended up with a better image of it. And then we actually went down and did a small excavation, and were able to find this period vessel, and we think it may well be the Packet. It could be the Anne and Ruth, the schooner, but 6 and 1/2 dozen. So we're not 100% sure what the other vessels are. They need to be looked at. There's 2 more possible wrecks. That little island had to form on something. They shoal up on obstacles, so another vessel could be there. So we might have all 5 vessels in that area. They're just not really obvious. And because I'm so short-staffed, we mostly address ones that are threatened by something. In this case, this one, we're worried that it may get hit in one of the dredge operations when they're trying to clear the channel. So we pay a fair bit of attention to this one. We haven't got to the others yet. Perfect master's topics for students. So I'd be delighted if some of the students wanted to do that. Come and do that. We had two theses come out of this area. So our next site is in the sassafras, and this is at the same time. After they burned Havre de Grace on May 3rd, call was sent out for the Cecil County militia to form in anticipation of an attack on Frederickstown. Let's go here. So Frederickstown is in Cecil County. Georgetown is in Kent County. They are sort of sister towns. And but only 80 men responded to come to Cecil County, to come to Fredericktown. And less than a third of them had any ammunition at all. They didn't even have weapons, a lot of them. Even fewer men assembled across the river in Kent County to protect Georgetown. They did build a small battery up it was called Fort Duffy in Fredericktown, and you can see it here in this 1900s bridge, but you can see the topography because the leaves are off the trees. So there is a bit of a bluff up here, and they did set up a small battery up there. On the other side, it's much flatter on the Georgetown side, but on Point Pierce, they put in some earthworks and they sort of hunkered down and waited. Coburn, on the night of the 5th, they started coming up the river. They'd attacked Frenchtown first, then Havre de Grace. Now they're starting to head for Fredericktown. They captured a small boat and sent it ahead and said, tell the citizens, if no one fires on us, we won't burn your town, except we will burn military supplies and we will take any vessels. However, someone found the logbook from the brig Mohawk, and the British did intend to burn both towns, apparently. So they were not being truthful. If you are looking at it today, this is the bridge, and it is a swing bridge because it's so low. But you can see all these moorings. You can imagine this is full of metal and concrete. These are marinas with roofs. And we had to survey both sides of this as well as the river. And you can see this is a bit of a nightmare. You drag a magnetometer through here, it's going to go berserk, because not only are each of these vessels tied to what you can just barely see, these little white speckles, mooring balls, a whole field of mooring balls with chains that go down to either a concrete block with a metal eye or a metal mushroom anchor. So all the marinas, so we did survey in the winter, but we had to pretty much stick to Sidescan. The mag would not work in here. We did run it. We picked up some signals, but we had to allow for a lot of interruption anywhere except the channel here. And over in this way, if you keep going just off the map here, that's where the Kitty Nighthouse is. Some of you may have eaten there or stayed there. And the story is, of course, Kitty Knight was renting the house at that time, and she pleaded with Admiral Coburn not to burn it and not to burn the house of an elderly widow next door, and succeeded in saving both structures. After the war, she bought the house in 1836, so it is the Kitty Nighthouse, but it's and you can actually stay overnight there and have lovely meals and things. This is what the British drew, and they've made a small error, but they're looking up the river. This is the battery that's firing at them from Fort Duffy, and you can see they've got American batteries, A. Here's where they messed up, though. B is not Georgetown, C is Georgetown, and B is Fredericktown. They just got the names wrong. But they did attack and burn both towns. Georgetown was a little more developed, so it got it worse. But they did burn. That's why it was such an achievement for Kitty Knight to save her house. So we did... this is where Fort Duffy is now, unfortunately. When you're up there, it's all affiliated with one big marina, and literally where the battlements were and everything. We couldn't find a trace of anything. I expect they were either pulled out with the swimming pool or they're under it. They wouldn't let us dig too much up in their shrubberies either. We might have found some vestiges, but that's Fort Duffy. You can see it had a lovely view for the British coming up the river. And this is what we did manage to survey. As you can see, we had to avoid the heavily, I got all excited there again, got this heavily populated area with a lot of metal. We got a few metal signatures here, several, the blue are all metal signatures, and the two white ones are actually side-scan sonar. And so you can see, that's the one that's out in the river. Oh, someone has two computers on. This is the one that's out in the river. We have not gone to look at that one yet. It's in the center of the river. This one was the one toward the shallows. It's definitely a boat, but it's more of a modern workboat. So like a crabbing skiff or something. So not a lot left. They claim that they may have burned 5 or 6 vessels here, but the numbers are a bit iffy, but we didn't see enough traces of anything. So again, not somewhere we're going to race right back to, unfortunately. Now we're going to, even though this was the very last effort of the British, it was in September of 1814. We're going to stop there now since we're moving south. Bombardment of Baltimore. And it always looks a bit funny with these big loopy bombs coming down, but that's legit. Those are mortars. And the intent is you want them to come up and over. You can't fire through the walls. You want them to come up and over the walls and blow up inside. So we know the British fired something like 1,400, 1,500 shells, well, not shells, but cannonballs and bombs at Fort McHenry. We know that about 400 of them landed, as some number burst in the air, obviously, but the rest of them ended up in the water. And so we're very interested in this. So looking at Fort McHenry, you can see with the earthworks, you can't get through those. And they were successful in actually putting one bomb up and over and into the roof of the ammo dump and did blow up inside, which reduced their ammunition, but did not obviously cause the fort to fall. This was September 12th to the 15th in 1814. What we're going to talk about, Bladensburg, was in August. So they went immediately up here. This is what we do see that is a result of the bombardment. Every time they dredge out Baltimore Harbor, lots of weird and wonderful and scary things come up. And these are the ones that are a mishmash of things. These 2 shells, the egg-shaped ones, are early forms of Schenkel shells. We had 5 of them. They're closer to the Civil War than anything else, and they were still live and had to be destroyed, incredibly unstable. This is what those 4-pounders, those swivel guns would fire, and small batteries, not very effective, good for taking down rigging, good for anti-personnel. These 2 are interesting because they are French. They are a weird caliber. They don't match anything else. And the cool thing was we know that there was 1 French cannon at Fort McHenry. So these had to have been fired by it. Like, that is so neat that we can actually take these to the back. We did not see any with the British broad arrow on it. I was asking if I should call the British Embassy if we did find them. Technically, it's marked theirs, but of course, when you fire something at someone, you're not intending to get it back. So it fits under the laws of abandonment. They were throwing it away and didn't want it back. This is one of the classic War of 1812 bombs. Yes, you put your powder in here and your fuse, but you know them because there's a pocket here, and there's a bar goes over it. And this is what they use, these little lifting cranes. If you guys use a small crane to lift an engine out of a car, it looks really similar. They'll lift these up and put them in the mortars because they're quite large and quite heavy. They're bigger, they're about the size of a bowling ball, a little bit bigger, but trying to do that time and time while you've got lit fuses and things, they use those for firing. Civil War ones are even larger, but we recognize them because they have holes bored into them, tapered holes, and you use these things that are sort of like ice picks almost to pick them up. So that's definitely one of the War of 1812 bombs. So that's what we get out of these. There were a number of ships sunk in Baltimore deliberately to block the harbor. And we know about those, and we know they were rescued because it was done deliberately. The owners were promised insurance money or repayment or replacement, and then didn't get it. And there were huge insurance claims and arguments with the government for some time after the war to get there, because some of them were claiming that they were nearly rotten, and they were claiming they were brand new. Some were relatively new. So they had to sort out who was legit and get everybody paid back. But there were no wrecks left in the water from that. So this is what we were looking for up there. Now we're going to go down. This is the main body of where Maryland's sort of claim to fame for the War of 1812 takes place. And there's actually 3 spots, but one of them, again, there were no wrecks. This is Cedar Point off of Patuxent Naval Air Station. Cedar Point, there is a Battle of Cedar Point for the War of 1812. We've surveyed this area because there were also 2 state Navy vessels from the Revolutionary War that were allegedly lost in that area. We haven't found them yet. So we were looking at it for 2 reasons, but we'll move on for a moment, just so you know where it is, because I didn't mark it. So here's our hero, Joshua Barney. During the, he started out as a privateer in the Revolutionary War. By the end of the war, he was a very successful privateer. He became legit Navy. He retired after the Rev War. When War of 1812 started, he came out of retirement and offered his services. Now, there's a book called Captain's Contentious, and it's quite funny because it's about all the infighting among the various captains and admirals, like trying to get rank. John Paul Jones is in there and a number of others. Because since he retired, he lost his spot in the pecking order for promotions. So when he came back, they were like, what can we do with this guy? We can't bring him in over other people and put him back in the Navy. So they made him a Commodore. They put him in charge of this mosquito fleet that was going to, that was supposed to escort convoys to the mouth of the bay past the British, that was supposed to harass the British because they were very small, shallow drafted vessels that could run in and out of the shoals and knew the area and basically, cause havoc and be a nuisance like mosquitoes. So he agreed to come back under those. They took some vessels out of the Jeffersonian mothball fleet. Some of them, they built at least two new ones, gunboats 137 and 138 in Baltimore. This is back when he was being a privateer. So he was taking a convoy, and the number varies because if a Navy man counts vessels and a civilian counts vessels, the numbers aren't necessarily the same because Navy says, well, that doesn't count. That's not a real ship. That's a this or a that, whereas civilians count anything that's floating. So some say 14 or 15, some say 17 vessels were with him, or that his entire fleet was 17, including some merchant vessels. I've heard it's about 13 and 17, something like that. So it's a fair sized fleet coming down the bay to get to the mouth. By the time they got to Cedar Point down here, they saw the British over near Hooper's Island, and the British saw them. So they had to scurry inside the Patuxent, and they did have some action here. And this is where they discovered that their fancy two new boats from Baltimore were not very helpful. They were slow. The men hated them. They said they can hold people or cargo. They keep nothing dry. And Barney was really tempted to leave them behind as liabilities, but one of them had all the food on it. So they had to save them. They ended up coming up the Patuxent and went into St. Leonard's Creek, which is a bit like going into a blind alley, but there's a reason. A fellow who owned the farm right here, and his name will come back to me in a second. He, like Judge Bean and like Francis Scott Key, Skinner was in charge of prisoner exchange. So if you're going to get caught near the guy who can bargain you back out. So they went up in here. And of course, the British followed and sat out here because their vessels were too large to get in. And there were two battles. The first battle of St. Leonard's Creek took place up here near Johns Creek. And if you know where Vera's White Sands is, it's right at the juncture of Johns Creek and St. Leonard's. You could have sat on the tiki deck and watched the battle. They sent up the Congreve rocket barges, trying to get Barney to come out. He wouldn't. He received orders that he either needed to take all his boats apart and pull them overland, and there is a creek here, and put them into the bay again and come around behind the British. I can imagine some sailorly language being spoken with that idea. The second thing came out is no, what was the British, Cochrane was going up the Potomac towards Washington. It was intended to be a feint. Baltimore was the goal because that's where the commerce was. Washington really was a swamp, but it was going to be a feint. But then they realized that they had Cochrane was up the Potomac, Coburn was up the Patuxent. They had Washington in a pincer move, and they said, oh, this is too good not to do. So they started, they had their orders to go up the river. And Barney got his orders to escape at all costs and head up and to come across land to Washington, to the aid of Washington. So the first battle was, as I was saying, June 8th to the 10th up on near Johns Creek. Then the second battle down here, which is also where Mr. Skinner lived, is Jefferson Patterson Park and Museum. So there were earthworks here. They built hot shot cannons. They fired hot shot. The British pulled back just enough. The Barney's flotilla got out. Before he left, he scuttled those two pain in the neck boats, the new ones. We don't know where all the merchant vessels were. We suspect that some of them were with him. Some might have been captured early, but we have reason to think that some of them went with him. They all scurried up as far as they could. This is Jug Bay, by the way, down this way. So, or in here, pardon me. So you all, if you're paddling up that way, you're going to be in the same neighborhood. So, but we're going to head way up into the upper level of the Patuxent. But before we do, I want to well, I'll leave them up there for a moment. This is St. Leonard's Creek when we came into survey. So here's Johns Creek. Here is the rest of the creek going up. Here is Rivera's. And we had a ton of signals in here. And it turned out it was a very historic vessel, but it was much later. It's a vessel called the Widgeon. We found all these metal hits here, nothing showing up on Sidescan, but there's a cable crossing here. So these aren't surprising. Up here, we have all this metal. Every single one turned out to be a gooseneck from a sink, a brake rotor. It was all rubbish. Did we find the vessels? Yes, over here. These were the ones that were so graphitized, they gave no metal signal. What happened was the author, Donald Chomet, got out of the boat to step the anchor down into the mud, and he went stomping around and he went, I think I'm on timbers. So all this fancy equipment, we just needed Dawn barefoot. And this is a model of what we believe, judging from Barney's descriptions. These sweeps are 27 pounds a piece. The men had to row standing up as far as we can figure from the seat spacing. You can sail them as well. They usually have one gun on them. But we did find the two vessels that we believe Barney scuttled. Now, I'm going to jump ahead for just a moment. These are the students from East Carolina University doing field school, and they found both of them. Now, when Barney left them, they just sank them because they maybe thought they could get them back. After the Battle of Bladensburg, the British came back punitively to punish all the towns that had supported Barney. And when they came up to St. Leonard town, or St. Leonard's, they found the locals scavenging these for nails because, of course, they were lead lined because of the food. So there's nails inside, there's nails outside. The locals were scavenging them. So they've been scuttled and scavenged. The British then further scavenged them and burned them. So we weren't expecting to find very much at all on these vessels. Now, one thing that's interesting on this one, which was the less damage, this one was quite burned. There are 3 mast steps, 2 here and 1 here. There's only one, there are 2 masts on these, but we wonder if this wasn't an effort by the men to improve those horrible sailing capabilities, moving the mast, trying to make it faster or less wet. We're not sure, but that was a bit of speculation. We did find a 75 caliber impacted shot. That's what the British used. Makes sense. These vessels were almost lost at Cedar Point. We found brand new 69 caliber shot. Never fired. This is what the Americans used. It's what all Americans use. This is what you'd use to go hunting. But in the context, it's useful. There's other artifacts, but I'm showing you the most important. This is a button from probably a cuff, and it's got its maker's mark and date. So it came from Waterbury, Connecticut. And thank goodness it dates to the right. It's not too late. It fits. So we have no doubt. There are other artifacts as well, but so we know we have these vessels. Now, what also happens in history is maps are made, wonderful, but maps are also copied religiously without any query. Errors that are made are perpetuated. This map is of the action on the Upper Patuxent, but it was actually drawn up in about 1835. And someone in that red square swears that they know that Barney's flotilla was destroyed there, August 22nd, 1814, between Upper Marlborough and Queen Anne. And the number of people who show up at my office with that map going, I know where it really is. I know where the treasure at Oak Island is. And it's like, how many times I've seen this map. We have been through this area with a fine tooth comb, and we've subsequently figured out what happened. You could not line boats up like that. If you're up there, your oars are touching the sides. And there's been changes, but not that many. So we're saying, So we are interested in what happened here, but let's go back here for a minute. Here are some other maps that were a little bit more timely. Barney, the Pig Point is also known these days as Bristol Landing. It's a hugely important prehistoric site, pre-contact site, very deeply stratified, but it was also a steamboat landing called Bristol Landing. The British were sitting here and they said, we could see the flagpoles of the ships, the flotilla. We could see Barney's pennant as Commodore, and we saw them blow up one after another. I heard them and saw the masts go down. Barney had to scuttle his fleet so that the British couldn't take it, and march overland with the guns to Bladensburg for the battle over here, for the Battle of Bladensburg, which they did. And he left his son back to blow the vessels. And so this is a much more realistic place for them. And considering that's where we found a couple, that makes sense. And this is the other one. Here's a clearer one of Pig Point, where the flotilla was scuttled, not way up here. When they were at the Battle of Bladensburg, obviously, you all know the story that it was became known as the Bladensburg races because these polished British regulars who'd been fighting Napoleon marched in, and the local militia just ran so fast. It was like the Bladensburg races. The only people who held their ground were the militiamen. Barney was wounded, and General Ross, who was the army side of it, and Admiral Coburn, both Ross said to Coburn, and they went and visited him, and he said, see, I told you it was a flotilla men. They're the only ones who've given us any fight so far. So after the battle, the British, as I say, Cochrane returned down here. Coburn came back down the Patuxent. They did collect apparently at least some of the merchant vessels, because they said that they had to burn 6 of them as being unseaworthy with tobacco on them, and the tobacco was terrible. So we don't know where the rest of that fleet went. We don't know where all of Barney's ships are. If they went down sort of nose to tail like elephants, we should have found more of them. Well, here's that point. Here's Wayson's Corner, Route 4 crossing. These are all metal targets. This is Bristol Landing or Pig Point. One of these is the vessel I showed you with the cannon. Well, actually it's here. There's another one here that we have records of people in the 30s jumping off of, and photos swimming. And the Scorpion, one we believe to be the Scorpion, is right in here. The rest of these, nothing turned up when we explored, even around here where we really expected to find stuff. A lot of these were modern debris. So where is it really? We went back to look at the vessels. And this is the one, as I mentioned, is in Calvert Marine Museum. It's now considered somewhat inaccurate. They never had lateen sails. 1 gun. This one shows a gun at each end. They, in fact, were smaller than this. They varied in size, but the smaller ones only had 1 gun. This is a block sloop that Barney took and actually reworked a little bit. This is what we think the Scorpion was something similar to, but he took a lot of the well, he may not have taken, he took some of it off, and some of it may have come off in the salvage efforts, but that's a block sloop. Now, in the 80s, the Calvert Marine Museum under Dr. Ralph Eshelman and the author Don Chomet built a, what do you call it, plywood cofferdam around a portion of what we believe to be the Scorpion, and did some excavation. It was, the trust didn't, well, trust did exist, but permits weren't a thing at the time. There was no maritime program. They brought this up. This is a camboose, a deck stove. Terribly useless on these vessels. They're too small. Remember the guys rows standing up? They're not eating on board. They go to shore every chance they get. In storage, they found 2 of these punch tin Paul Revere lanterns. Again, absolutely useless on a vessel. Hence the reason they were so beautiful and in storage. Nobody wanted them. What they did find that's helpful, the medical kit, part of it. Yes, that would be on the flagship. And they found this grog cup with the initial, yes, the C is backwards, initial CW. One of the things they did when they sank those 2 vessels and scuttled them in St. Leonard Creek, they had to take the people and the supplies. That was the food supplies. Caesar Wentworth was the cook. He's the only person with those initials on the muster roll, and he was put on the Scorpion. So pretty good sign that we have the Scorpion at this site. This is kind of a cool find. The date's right, 1803. We don't want it any later than 1814. It's a chaw penny. So it's the size of an Old English penny. So it's oversized, big, like about a 50-cent piece in silver. The sailors liked to chew tobacco. They liked to cut a chaw of tobacco. They served barefoot. You don't want to cut your chaw on the wood and make splinters. So, because you have to walk on that. So they would lay down one of these pennies and cut their tobacco. And these are called chaw pennies. And so it's quite a find. The dates work. We're really thrilled with that find as well. Now we went back in 2009, 10, and 11, trying to find more information because this other work was done in the 80s. We went back to the Scorpion. We ran the magnetometer. This is the cesium one that I showed you. The Navy brought in, Naval History and Heritage Command brought in big barges because the Corps of Engineers says if we disturb the bottom, we can't put the dirt back. We have to screen it. We have to put it in those big dumpsters and dewater it. And then it has to be trucked to an approved dump site. And this is why things get very expensive. But that's what happened. We tried to store some underground with not bringing it to the surface. So they said we wouldn't have to do that then, but it really was difficult. So we did some excavation for those 3 years. And we did get some interesting evidence. Just to show you, I do get in the water. I hate it when people say to me, do you dive? It's like, yes, I'm a master instructor. I teach. But that's, yeah, coming out. We had good clay layer over the wood, beautiful preservation. We got a grant to test this. It looks like a Klingon Death Star, but it is called a radiometer from a company in Canada called Marine Magnetics. That's a GPS signal at the top. The 2 orange tubes are flotation, and it takes readings in 3 dimensions from the other, from these 3 wings. This is just a stabilizer. And we tried all kinds of fancy things with that, and it gave us some more signals. Some of them matched what we had. Here's the vessel we were looking at as a Scorpion. One's here, that was a stolen bicycle. That was a stolen VW van. But these other ones, like this, looked so strong. I even had Navy divers who were looking for some training come in and dig like banshees in there. Nothing came up. None of these turned up anything. There has to be something that's sending those signals. And this was not that deep, so we had no reason to think these would be any deeper. We are exploring, like, did the river change direction? That was that ground penetrating radar. Down where you all will be paddling at Jug Bay or pontooning, there's the remains of a swing bridge, a rail bridge, which is a whole nother story that's very interesting. We wondered if putting that in and the berm, the hiking trail at Jug Bay, was part of the railway. Did that reconfigure the river? But some of the things were exactly where they were supposed to be. So it gets really dicey. So I showed you these. This is where we started looking at the actual wreck. Now, this is the best visibility we ever had, and it's relatively shallow. When they excavated in the 80s, they thought that it was facing downstream and that the bow had been heavily damaged when they blew it up to sink it. When we did our excavation, we found this big mooring ring facing upstream. So the area that they thought had been so damaged actually was the hold, and that's why they were able to find all those pieces. But what we did find, I'll back for just one sec, on the bow here, there was no cannon because, of course, they were all taken to go to Bladensburg. But I did find this big chunk of lead, and that is part of the ballast. And we're like, why is this sitting on the bow? So we did some more research, and that's when we discovered that this area that everybody keeps saying up near Princess Anne, that's where it is. That's where they set up a major salvage camp, and they majorly salvage these. And that probably explains why we're not finding the merchant vessels, why we're not, maybe what's sending off the mag are like cannonballs that roll down into deep, deep mud, and there's no hulls to be found. We're not sure, but it could be pieces of lead like this. But there was a major ongoing salvage effort at the time. So that answers one of our questions as well. So, and also once we were exploring, the Navy found another piece of the medical kit that matches. Isn't that nice when things match, the maker's mark? And I only put Baltimore in here as just a segue, because I know we're running quite late, but I'll want to show you one thing, and I will be very quick. This isn't published yet. I mentioned the importance of privateers to the war effort in War of 1812. And you can see the numbers, and they were hugely effective. And after the war, you had a choice: go straight or become a pirate. You can't be a privateer. Some of them tried to hedge it. They went down to Central America and South America, tried to sign up as mercenary privateers for another country. Still illegal up here. So it's really hard to trace data. A lot of the ships, which were so fast and so well built, were turned into slaving vessels, unfortunately, because they're fast. Some of them were just listed as sold out of the country. Well, they were sold to these South American countries. Thomas Boyle was one of our best privateers, hugely successful. His vessel, the Chasseur, is the one that, which is the Hunter, is the one that the Pride of Baltimore is modeled on. And you'll notice the raking masts and things. It means nothing. Those just make it look fast. It has no ship advantages. And you can see here, they look very speedy. It's like putting, pinstripes on your car, racing licks or something. He was terribly successful. One of his young gunners, interestingly enough, was a freed black man, George Roberts, who lived long enough into the era of photography. So we actually see him here as an old man. But he was a freed man and served on as a privateer in the War of 1812. But the vessels that were sold out, we became very interested when down in the Gulf of Mexico, Shell Oil was doing survey work for one of their, for a pipeline or for one of their oil heads, wellheads, and they are obliged to do survey, and they saw this signal. This is in 6,000 feet of water. And they started to explore, and they sent down an ROV, remotely operated vehicle. And so NOAA got involved, and we were worried that it might be a Texas state vessel. They were missing one that they can't account for. We think it's a privateer from the Bay, and I'll just skip ahead. It's got one gun, a swivel gun. That's what we saw after the War of 1812, late 1814, 15. This vessel we think is post-war, maybe 1818. These deck stoves are very identifiable. It stands, we use multi-beam, it stands up from the bottom a bit. There's not much wood left, but it was copper lined. So we took these vessels. First year was the Okeanos. The second year we rented Bob Ballard's boat, went down to look at it. This is the stern, and that's one of the Chesapeake markers, that they are so dramatic. And and copper sheaths, which is a very well-to-do privateer, possibly. And this is the bow. And all of the, there's all kinds of stuff scattered through it. When you look at a pirate ship or a privateer ship, you see officer type goods scattered throughout because it's much more democratic. So we see water, we see liquor bottles, we see dishes. We did collect samples. This is a book. We could not get it. We're very interested in trying to go back, but it was so fragile. We have to have a better strategy to get that out. This was the medics' quarters. We actually have jars of ginger, and all this had to be done with one a snuffly arm that sucks things up, and a big beastie arm on the left that does heavy duty work. They would be put in this box filled with sand, and then it was unpinned and it rocketed to the surface with a GPS marker, and we had a chase boat go get it. The guns are old. They're the Rev War era. Well, pirates go and buy from like Army surplus in the Caribbean. You don't have the latest stuff. Swivel gun, very War of 1812. These are the guns with a big anemone on it. This is the swivel gun on the bottom. We know they were at least went to the Yucatan partly. That's their water. We found 2 more vessels. One was carrying hides and fat tallow. Think of 2 years before the mast, only this was running from Cuba to Mexico. And we found another iron hulled or copper hulled one with no cargo that was identifiable. Could have been fruit, could have been slaves. We haven't looked at those 2 vessels yet, but all 3 had their navigation gear, which means nobody got out alive. That's the first thing you take so that you can get to shore. And all 3 vessels still had that. So there were no survivors of these vessels. That's some of the tallow and rolls of hide on that one vessel. We've got another stove. It was a big ship, you can see this nav gear. And there's some, people would love to believe that it was part of Jean Lafitte's vessels. They were vaguely heading west. He was in Galveston at the time, and it sells a good story. And if you're fundraising, it might be fun, but we have no way to prove that it's connected with Lafitte at all. It just makes a good story. So those are vessels that are not published, and we have a lot more work to do on those. And I'm sorry I ran so long, but I will stop now. And if there's anyone left, we'll answer questions.
Susan, there's plenty of people left because that was fascinating and we want to know more. Thank you so much. Let's do some questions and from the audience. You can put it in the chat box or you can raise your hand and I will acknowledge you, and you can unmute yourself. I have a question. I'm going to start it off because I can. You mentioned that as when the Chesapeake Bay is dredged, lots of interesting things come up. Is it required that all of the dredge material must be gone through for artifacts? Is that part of a process or no?
It's supposed to. What happens and kind of how they get around it, and it's not really malicious, it's just money. When the Corps dredges channels, if they've been dredged in the past, it's called maintenance dredging and they don't have to talk to us. But we all know that only if they're going deeper, or say they're taking out a sharp curve, a dog leg, then it would, then they're supposed to call us. But you know that when you dredge, it's like digging at the beach, the sides collapse in. And so new things can be introduced. We were called in for all those cannonballs. There were a lot more. There were 40 some solid shot. And there was a giant Civil War one that was 325 pounds with 7-inch walls and an 8-inch powder pocket. Fuse was still in it. And the bomb guys are rolling it around and we're all backing up. And then the fuse fell out and the powder poured out and they said, ma'am, it's inerted. So they didn't have to damage it. It's all on display at Fort McHenry, actually. A lot of it is, if you wanted to see it.
Okay, and Jeff asks, is it possible to date a cannonball?
Maybe. You can certainly do it by poundage, and you can sort of tell what guns were in use in various areas. And the British did mark everything, but it's by weight, a 32 pounder, a 9 pounder. So we know when certain cannon came in. And also once you start going to shells, like I said, with those bombs, we can tell a War of 1812 bomb from a Civil War bomb, from a grenade. I actually have pieces of a grenade from about 1750, 2 of them. Actually, my classes held them. Then obviously they've fallen apart because they weren't conserved. You can, to a certain extent. There are things like those are early Schenkel shells. They change form. So we do talk to a lot of ordnance experts to get them to look at things. Hotchkiss shells came up. There are different ones. Cannonballs are, I think, a bit harder, but again, they knew which ones the French were using because that they wouldn't work in an American cannon. So you can to a certain extent, yeah. And often the cannons can be dated because you look for foundry marks, or we know that some of them were poured, some were bored out, and it varies from nation to nation how that's done. The egg-shaped projectiles were there are two questions. Lou, the caliber that the Americans used, I think, was 69 caliber, and the British, I think, was 75. And the egg-shaped ones were early versions of Schenkel shells. They changed shape later.
Todd, did you have your hand up? Go ahead and unmute.
Yeah, I grew up on Bear Creek. And my cousin did his dissertation on Barney and his flotilla back in late 70s, early 80s, and said that during his research, he found that there were encampments around Bear Creek where the medical personnel were gathered to help the people that were in the skirmishes at the Battle of North Point.
Definitely.
Is that true?
Yes, it is. And in fact, they're, they haven't found it, but a friend of mine, she's now the county archaeologist for Charles County, Esther Reed, was telling me about pits of arms and legs that out behind the tents. They'd kind of been looking for them, sort of, but from the medics' tents. Yeah, that was true. I didn't cover it because there wasn't a lot in the water, but yes, certainly they, and that's where Ross met. They were camped in that area and were moving, when they were trying to make their attack. And I think that's where Ross bought it. He was hit by a sniper. And also where you see the red, white, and blue buoy, I meant to bring the sheet in. There's a whole sheet of myths for War of 1812. But the ones where the red, white, and blue buoy, where they say that's where Francis Scott Key was when he saw the flag and all this, it's about a mile off, at least a mile off where they would have actually been. He wouldn't have seen the vessel, and they would have had a different flag up because it was raining, and they would have had their battle flag. But you hate to ruin a good story completely, so I'll just leave it there.
Okay, thank you.
All right.
Esther's still sorry.
Sandy wants to know where your backdrop was taken.
That's Mallows Bay. Each of those vessels is about 265 feet long. They are World War I steamers. And we actually have, that was the talk I gave about Curtis Bay. There are 18, maybe 19, I think I might have found another one, in and around Hawkins Point and Curtis Bay. And they were part of this fleet that was sold off early and bought by Davison Chemical. And they actually used them to bring pyrites from Cienfuegos, Cuba, but they found out they're so slow and they are so big that to get a paying cargo, it just wasn't feasible. So they used them for a year and then junked them. So if you go down to Walnut Cove, you'll see the Fort Scott, the Dover, and the Ashland. And if you're down near the paint company, it's farther down. There's the Portland and possibly the Box Butte. And there's another 14 across the top of Hawkins Point. And they're all the same fleet. They were merchant marine vessels. And it was in World War I, and they were going to carry, not military, they were going to carry supplies for the beleaguered allies, and almost none of them, in fact, none of them made it to the theater of war because the war ended a bit early, which is not a bad thing ever. And a lot of them were still being built. So instead of 1,000 vessels, they had fewer than 200 completed. And I think another 150 almost in various stages that were maybe converted right to schooner barges or scows. And the majority of the fleet was sold for the cost of one vessel and put down at Mallows. And it's now a national marine sanctuary. So, and it's great paddling. There's something new every time of the year. So we're just putting the buoys out, the paddling trail buoys out soon. I don't want people out there before May really, because the water's so cold. But someone said about paddling tours at Curtis Bay. Not yet, because I want to go first. The problem is I worry about anyone who falls in there. There's a real E. coli problem, not to mention all the other weird chemicals, because the environmental rules didn't come in until the 1970s or 80s. And that's a chemical company that's been running since the 1830s. And the shipbuilding companies and things were not until almost the 90s. We're still using carcinogenic bottom cover anti-fouling. So I'm wary of who I would encourage to go there. I haven't even paddled it myself. Lou Novak's on this. Thank you for coming, Lou. He and I have been talking about this forever. And we had it set up once and it fell through, but because he's with Coast Guard too, I'd like to do a couple paddles myself. I want to see how bad the boat traffic is. The only access point isn't open on Sunday, or the nearest access point. So it's logistics, and also I would be wary of taking anyone that has the vaguest possibility of falling in. We'd have to decontaminate you or something. I don't know. Take you off for a come with your tetanus shot, and I don't know what else you do for sewage. But it's so industrial. I'm wary of it. It is very cool, but I as I say, I'm not sure I'd want to be the responsible adult on that. If I were there and other people showed up to paddle, fine, as long as I'm not your mom.
Lou actually asked, he had heard U.S. Marines were routed at Bladensburg. Is that true?
The U.S. ones, unfortunately, all the American lines broke. They were heavily outnumbered. You had hardened battle veterans. The only thing in your favor was that the British were wearing those horrible, awful, heavy wool red clothes in August in Maryland. Can you imagine? They were keeling over from humidity, maybe. But unfortunately, yeah, it was an absolute rout, and that's why they called it the Bladensburg races. The militia broke line, and then everybody else had to give. So that's why they ended up being able to burn Washington. There are people who say that was in retaliation for the Americans burning Fort York, which is now Toronto, and that's not really true. Fort York was a toilet. Nobody cared about it. They burned Port Dover. That riled up the. They might have been burning Washington in revenge for Port Dover, but not for Fort York. So, and there are people who say maybe we should invite them back again, and have them burn Washington again. And they can do Toronto these days as well, actually, from what I've heard. Anyhow.
Dave asked, do you have a book that covers this presentation, or do you recommend a book?
I would recommend the second edition, the newest edition of a book called Flotilla by Donald Shomette. That's Shomette. Don wrote an earlier one called Flotilla, which is out of print. But to be honest, he's not a trained scholar. He's got put an E on that one. Shomette has an E, Donald Shomette. But now that he's got so many books under his belt, he's probably got 20. And his second version of Flotilla is infinitely better. It's so much better referenced. It's so much more polished. It's so much more, it's got more footnotes. And that's where he found a lot of information about the salvage efforts. And so I think that's a much better reference book. He did do another one called Tidewater. Is it Tidewater Time Capsule? History of the Patuxent in general. And that's a super readable book. It's really, I think it's my favorite of all his books. It's sort of betwixt and between being super scholarly and being a fun read. And that includes a lot of the work that he did there with, like, they called it the turtle shell wreck because technically we still can't prove it's the scorpion, but I think we've proven it's the scorpion. He wasn't sure. He thought it was. So I think his Tidewater Time Capsule, and then his most recent version of Flotilla. And if you're interested in Mallows, he wrote one called Ghost Fleet of Mallows Bay and Other Tales of the Lost Chesapeake. So a third of the book is about Mallows, 2/3 of it are about other sites in the Chesapeake. But he's a very good maritime author. He's very readable. And quite funny, actually, if you get a chance to hear Don. He just wrote a monster one called Anaconda about the Civil War. And in fact, he won the Brewington Prize for that last year. It was hands down. I was on the committee, and I know we came in and we all just looked at it and went, oh, wow. And it's a wonderful book. So yeah, those are super good books on those topics. I don't have time to write anything. I still have I have 4 boxes sitting in my kitchen for a book I'm supposed to be writing about building aircraft carriers out of ice for World War II, which was part of my dissertation research. So that's how far behind I am on that baby. It will happen.
All right. You've given us a lot to chew
I did.
on.
I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to run so long, but
oh no, it's absolutely fine. It was wonderful. Does anybody have any other questions for Dr. Langley?
I'll put my email in the chat, and if you have a brilliant insight at 3 a.m, I might even be up. You never know. Because we had the Ever Given. We were a lot of stakeholders involved with that, so we were very happy. Not Ever Given, Ever Forward. We were very happy to see it make it out of the bay. or make it at least out of the bank of the bay. There we go. So yeah, if you have a question or anything, shoot me a note.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Langley, and I hope that we can call on you again, maybe to share some more knowledge with us at a later date. And
yeah.
And folks, there's plenty of opportunities for us to get together and learn more. So I hope that you take advantage of those. And everybody stay well and stay curious. I hope to see everybody soon. Take care.
Bye.
Thank you.
Good night.